Hello, it's Marshall Chess here again, continuing the story of my father. Luckily, I was at the first Chess Records recording session, Universal Recording Studios in Chicago. It was a jazz instrumental called My Foolish Heart with that star from the Macombo Lounge, Gene Ammons. And my father, being a very superstitious person, by then he had picked up all of the Afrocentric superstitions from all his exposure to black people. So he named the label Chess Records. The first record was 1450. That was after their apartment address, 1450 Karlov Avenue. So he was always into being a superstitious guy. I am myself. I guess I inherited that trait. One of the first artists that he recorded was Muddy Waters. Some of the first releases on the new Chess Records label were My Foolish Heart, Gene Ammons, Rolling Stone by Muddy Waters, an acoustic style blues, and That's All Right by Jimmy Rogers, who's actually the guitar player in the Muddy Waters band. They were successes right away, not big successes. Those kind of blues records in that era sold very few, a few thousand they would be happy to have initially in Chicago. It wasn't easy to spread it around America. That was the next job of establishing Chess Records. It was a great time to begin being in the independent record business. Labels were springing up all over. Modern Records and the West Coast, Atlantic, King in Cincinnati. These labels were formed by young guys who were making their own waves, recording artists, paying disc jockeys with payola, which was legal, to play their records on the radio. And this was the beginning of rock and roll, of R&B. It was the seed of all these great forms of music. Without the independent record business being established, that would have never happened probably. The major labels, RCA, Capitol, Columbia, they were very stiff, racist, didn't know how to promote. It was a whole different era. Young people would have no idea how difficult it was to get exposure to music then. Chess expanded very rapidly. Not only did we have Muddy Waters, his initial success was so important. He was the magnet that drew the Beethovens and Bachs of blues to chess. They saw this label Chess is getting success with Muddy. All of a sudden, we had Sonny Boy Williamson on our roster. We had Memphis Slim. We had Little Walter, who was the harmonica player with Muddy Waters Band. All the greats came. John Lee Hooker, Howling Wolf from Sam Lewis. Howling Wolf, who was one of the first artists produced by Sam Phillips, who later started Sun Records, which Elvis was on, and Jerry Lee Lewis. He leased masters of Howling Wolf to us at Chess. My father loved it so much, he had Wolf move up to Chicago and became a full-time chess artist, one after the other. Etta James, Coco Taylor, Mitty Collier. We then went into the jazz genre. Hello, it's Marshall Chess here again, continuing the story of my father. Been on my mind for the last week. It brought up a lot of memories. You can't imagine, as I'm digging into my memories about my father, how strange it is to hear the playback. And I'm remembering things that I haven't thought about ever, actually. So doing this is a therapeutic for me as well as I hope for you guys who are interested in my family's history, especially the history of my father and uncle. And of course, I'm speaking about my father because it was my father. The more I get into it, the more it blows my mind. Forget about him being a special father. He had a lot of weaknesses as a father. He never played catch with me. He taught me how to shake hands instead. But as a creator and businessman and creating an amazing thing from a black nightclub before the civil rights era, all the way to radio station WVON, the voice of the Negro, the most modern, progressive black radio news station in America at the time. This blew my mind. So let's continue the story. In 1950, after my father changed the name of Aristocrat Records to Chess Records, got rid of the nightclub and began working full time in the record business. And let me tell you, for an independent record company at that era, that meant driving around the country, establishing ways to distribute your product, establishing radio that would play the records. Otherwise, people didn't even know they existed. I went on the road with my father in 1955 in a car through the South. We would stop everywhere, anywhere that sold records, believe it. In some towns, barber shops in the black neighborhood was where records were sold. And he would go in there, and if he knew that local radio station was going to play a new Muddy Waters record, and he told that to the guy in the barber shop, they'd buy 10 copies for cash. My father would get in the car, we'd go and use that cash to pay the disc jockey to play it. And little by little, record distribution began being developed in America. But initially, it was done by businesses called one-stops. You see, the major record labels, RCA, Columbia, they had their own distribution. All these little new labels, Chess, Checker, Atlantic, Modern, as few of the many, had to find ways to get distribution. So around America, businessmen were smart enough to open up these new businesses called one-stops. A one-stop was where they would stock all of the records from these small labels. And then all the local record shops would come to them. Yes, it was more expensive. We would make less money, but we at least had distribution. At the same time, those one-stops and those local radio stations became our talent scouts. Many, many times we would get a phone call from some disc jockey in Pittsburgh who'd say, Leonard, I just played this record a guy brought in and the phone hasn't stopped ringing. You better sign this up. Next day, my dad would be in his car on the way to Pittsburgh trying to make a deal. We picked up a lot of hits that way. It was a rough and ready, wild in the West business then. I was lucky enough to be 13 when it all began, and I was around for the whole thing. I got to know all these great independent record men. The Erdigans, Ahmed and Neshawi from Atlantic, the Beheri brothers from Modern, George Goldner from N, Morris Levy from Roulette, Jaime Weiss, so many of them, and they were all like a fraternity. They would all tip off each other what disc jockeys played it, what radio stations, what was the best distribution. They were important. I've been to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in America. They missed that completely. They missed these explorers, these guys like Columbus who discovered it. They were the ones who made the record business. They've eliminated them. A few are mentioned, but those early pioneers is what made rock and roll possible. It's crazy. Anyway, they're in my mind, and as I tell you their names, I can see all their faces in my head. Many of them were at my bar mitzvah when I was 13. So let's get back to the blues. Luckily, Muddy Waters was an artist on Aristocrat Records when my father bought the label. Muddy Waters was the greatest blues singer of all ever, as far as I'm concerned, as far as most critics. He became Chess Records' magnet.
Pretty women jump and shout, and the world want to know what it's all about. Cat bowl. I got a mojo.
He was a magnet. Every blues singer wanted to be on Chess. Why? We got the records played. We got the records into the barbershops that sold them. We made enough action that they could work on weekends and make more money than they ever saw in their lives. So Muddy was the magnet. Along came Sonny Boy Williamson, John Lee Hooker, Howling Wolf, Memphis Slim, one after the other. All these fabulous blues stars came to Chess, and they all had hits. In 1955, a guy named Chuck Berry, who was a blues fan of Muddy Waters, came to Chicago. I'm going to tell you what happened in the next pod when Chuck went to see my father in Chicago.